Hello, everyone. Part 1 of our Westward expansion unit focused on American settlers, why they were moving west, and the technological developments that made it possible. However, it's important to remember that in every part of our history, there are multiple perspectives. Often, when one group gets what it wants, other groups don't. In order to develop a complete picture of westward expansion, we also have to look at the perspectives of the people who were displaced and treated as less than in order for the U.S. government to get what it wanted. In Part 2, we are going to refocus on the Native American tribes that had long lived in the Western territories, way before the United States existed. We are going to look at the westward expansion movement from their perspective. Our essential question for this lesson is this. How did westward expansion impact Native American communities? First, Native American tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne had been living in the Western territories for thousands of years before the United States existed as a country. They didn't believe in land ownership, so their people used the land freely as needed. In the early 1800s, settlers began to move into the area, and they had a very different opinion. Americans believed that the U.S. owned the land, and in Manifest Destiny, which stated that they had a God-given right to continue to spread throughout the land. Americans also viewed Native Americans as uncivilized people who didn't make good enough use of the land, so therefore it could be rightfully taken away from them. Native Americans strongly opposed westward expansion and would ultimately be forced to fight for their lands. Beginning in 1830, with the Indian Removal Act, the U.S. government sanctioned the forced relocation of Native American tribes in the interest of expanding the U.S. population. More than 46,000 Native Americans were forced from their homes in states like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee into what they called Indian Territory, that is now the state of Oklahoma. 4,000 people died on what became known as the Trail of Tears, and the forced relocation of Native Americans continued throughout the 19th century whenever the United States government wanted to control more land and expand its population westward. Time and again, the U.S. government forced treaties upon Native American tribes in order to get what they wanted, and time and again, the U.S. government broke those treaties to get the next thing. Over time, Native Americans grew to be rightfully distrustful of the American government, which from their perspective took away their homeland and their cultural identity. One notable instance where tensions between the two boiled over came in June 1876. The U.S. government wanted land in the Montana Territory and required Native American tribes in the area to relocate. However, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, leaders of the Sioux on the Great Plains, strongly resisted the mid-19th century efforts of the U.S. government to confine their people to Indian reservations. When a number of tribes missed a federal deadline to move to reservations, the U.S. Army, including Custer and his 7th Cavalry, was dispatched to confront them. Custer was unaware of the number of Native Americans fighting under the command of Sitting Bull at Little Bighorn, and his forces were outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed in what became known as Custer's last stand. The demise of Custer and his men outraged many white Americans and confirmed their image of Native Americans as wild and bloodthirsty. Meanwhile, the U.S. government increased its efforts to subdue the tribes. Within 5 years, almost all of the Sioux and Cheyenne would be confined to reservations. Through battles like Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn and continuous forced relocation, the Native American population was greatly reduced in the 19th century. As you can see on the maps, in the 150 years since the arrival of the English at Jamestown, Native American tribes were forced inland and then quickly onto small reservations spread across the Great Plains and the West. They went from living freely throughout the entire country to having severely diminished populations. Native Americans would not be considered U.S. citizens until 1924. And even then, they were restricted to reservations or forced to identify as African Americans if they were living off of the reservations. When Native people were allowed into American society, it was only under the pretense that they assimilate or adjust to the dominant American culture. Boarding schools where Native American children were sent didn't allow them to speak in their native languages and prevented them from celebrating their cultural traditions. Instead, they were taught English and required to honor American traditions. With the passage of the Dawes Act, the federal government was authorized to break up tribal lands into individual plots of land. Only Native Americans who accepted the allotments were allowed to become U.S. citizens. This was significant because, like I said before, they didn't believe in land ownership, so accepting the land meant going against their beliefs, but not accepting the land meant losing their homes. The act pushed Native Americans to assimilate into mainstream society by taking away their cultural and social traditions. In less than 100 years, westward expansion destroyed ways of life that Native Americans had practiced for centuries and took them from their homes. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned in this lesson. How did westward expansion impact Native American communities? How were Native Americans treated during this time period? How do you think their treatment and what happened during this time period impacted what society looks like today? All of these are important questions.